It was the kind of moment that would make anyone's blood boil, a moment that might have started as a routine, televised debate, but would quickly spiral into something far more personal. Have you ever felt that rush of anger when someone completely misjudges you? Or worse, when they publicly insult your character without a second thought? That was exactly what Karoline Leavitt was about to face. It was a chilly morning in late February, the kind of morning where the crisp air felt almost biting. The hustle of New York City was already in full swing, but Karoline sat quietly in her studio office, the bright overhead lights flickering above her as she reviewed her notes for the day's appearance on national television. As a rising star, in the conservative political world, Karoline had become accustomed to the glare of the spotlight, the cameras, and the hard-hitting questions. She was poised, composed, and ready to present her perspective with conviction. But today, something felt different. Something was off. As the minutes ticked closer to her live interview, Karoline felt a subtle unease settle in her stomach. She had been scheduled to face off against a liberal TV host, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper opinions. It wasn't the first time Karoline would debate someone like her, but there was something in the air this time that felt personal. She had heard whispers about the host's tendency to get under her guests' skin, pushing them to the brink of losing their cool. But Karoline wasn't about to let anyone rattle her. The studio doors opened, and her producer ushered her into the bright, polished set. Cameras zoomed in, lights blinding as she took her seat across from the host, who flashed a smile that barely reached her eyes. There was a tension in the room, a crackling anticipation that felt like an electric current. The host's voice cut through the silence with practiced ease. Today, we're talking about the rise of conservative voices in politics, and we're joined by none other than Karoline Leavitt. "Thanks for coming, Karoline," she said, her tone too sweet to be sincere. Karoline smiled, already preparing for what she knew was coming. Little did she know, what would come next would be something that would change the course of her career and her sense of self forever. "Let's dive in," the host continued. "The question everyone's asking, is there any depth to your conservative beliefs, or is this just a platform for personal gain?" The words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. Karoline froze for a split second, but only for a second. The sting of the insult landed hard. A line had been crossed, and the world would soon see the reaction. Karoline's heart raced as the host's question echoed in her mind. The way she phrased it, so pointed, so dismissive, left Karoline no choice but to confront the underlying attack. Platform for personal gain? The words cut deeper than any policy debate or political disagreement could have. This wasn't about ideas. This was about who she was and how the world saw her. She opened her mouth, the words fighting to come out. But there was a moment of hesitation, a deep breath she took before responding, trying to collect her thoughts. She could feel the cameras, lens watching, waiting for her to crack. But cracking wasn't an option, not for someone like Karoline. A rush of anger surged within her, followed by a wave of disbelief. She had been on the receiving end of public criticism before, but never like this. Never in a way that questioned her integrity. And in that split second, something inside her snapped. This wasn't just about the debate anymore, it was personal. "I'm here," she said, the words cool and controlled, "because I believe in the future of this country, not to feed my own ego." She could feel her pulse quicken as she continued, her voice growing steadier with each syllable. "I've spent my life working to make a difference, not for political points, but for real change. So, if you're looking for sound bites to feed your narrative, you've got the wrong person." The host's eyes narrowed, but she didn't back down. "Well, Karoline," she said with a faux sympathetic smile, "it's hard to take someone seriously when they claim to represent the people, but all they do is spew partisan talking points for a paycheck." Karoline's breath caught. The room seemed to close in on her. the harsh words, the public humiliation. It was a level of insult she hadn't expected. She could feel her cheeks flush with the weight of the attack. For a brief, fleeting moment, it felt like everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. Behind the camera, her manager, Steven, sat with his arms crossed, a furrowed brow etched on his face. He was a steadying presence, someone who had guided her since the early days of her career, but even he couldn't hide his frustration. Beside him sat her best friend, Rachel, her voice quiet but supportive. Rachel had always been the one to offer calm advice in chaotic moments, but now, even she seemed uncertain of how to respond. "Are you okay?" Rachel whispered, leaning in as the tension in the room grew thicker. But Karoline didn't have an answer, not yet. The air was too heavy, and her mind was racing. What did this moment mean for her career, her reputation? How far would she be willing to go to defend herself? One thing was certain, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Karoline left the studio that day, the weight of the insult still lingered in the pit of her stomach. The camera lights were off, but they seemed to burn brighter in her mind. She could almost hear the host's voice repeating, her cutting words, each syllable piercing deeper than the last. Personal gain. Ego. Not serious. Despite her best efforts to remain composed on air, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something essential had been fractured in that moment. Her phone buzzed incessantly as she stepped into the waiting car, the noise almost deafening in the confined space. Steven had already called 5 times, and there were dozens of unread messages from colleagues, friends, and even random followers offering their take on the debacle. "Karoline," Steven's voice was tight when she finally answered. "You need to get ahead of this. Don't let it spiral." She ran a hand through her hair, her pulse still quick. "I'm fine," she said, trying to sound confident. But it came out flat. The truth was, she wasn't fine. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced before. The public attack had shaken her, and worse yet, the reaction from her followers wasn't what she expected. Instead of a surge of support, her social media feeds were flooded with people questioning her credibility, her motives. The words personal gain seemed to echo through every comment. "What do you mean, get ahead of it?" she asked, her voice rising. I gave her an answer. "What more do you want from me?" Steven sighed. "I want you to take control of the narrative before it controls you. You need to post something, set the record straight. If you let this hang over you, it could be a real setback." Her chest tightened. The thought of posting something, a carefully crafted message to salvage her reputation, felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. Was she really going to let someone else dictate her response? "I don't want to be like them, Steven. I don't want to play their game." "I know," he said, his voice softening. "But right now, you are the one being played. Think about it. You're too big to let this slip." Karoline set the phone down, staring out the window as the city passed by. Too big. The words echoed, but the pressure mounted and doubt crept in, creeping under her skin. Was she really as untouchable as she'd convinced herself? Or had this incident cracked open a vulnerability she wasn't ready to face? Back at her apartment that night, she stared at her reflection in the mirror, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. How could I have handled that better, she thought. Had she been too defensive? Too quick to shut down the host's attack instead of turning it into an opportunity? Her reflection seemed to mock her with every passing second. Just as she was about to step away from the mirror, her phone buzzed again. A text from Rachel. "I think you need to hit back hard. They're waiting for you to back down. Show them you won't." The words burned into her. Back down. Was that really what she'd done? No, she couldn't back down. But how? The path forward seemed less clear than ever. And as the night grew darker, Karoline realized something. The pressure wasn't just about politics. It was about proving something to herself. Could she fight through the noise? Or would she let the world's judgment consume her? The next morning, Karoline sat at her kitchen table, her phone's screen glowing with new notifications. But this time, she wasn't rushing to check them. Instead, she stared at the device with a new kind of resolve, the weight of the past. 24 hours had finally caught up with her. Yet in that exhaustion, something had shifted. She wasn't the same person who had entered the studio yesterday. The insult had hurt, yes, but it had also revealed something she hadn't fully acknowledged before. She wasn't just battling for her career. She was battling for her truth. And if she didn't stand tall in the face of this, she'd lose something far more important than public approval. She'd lose herself. Karoline swiped through her messages, scanning the familiar texts from her supporters, but there was one that stood out. An email from her old mentor, James Caldwell. He was a seasoned political strategist who had helped guide her early career, teaching her not only about the game of politics, but also about the price of success. His message was brief, yet loaded with meaning. Karoline, sometimes the best way to win is to stop playing by the rules. Trust yourself, not the world's expectations. Don't let them define you. Fight back, but fight your own way. She sat back, rereading the words, letting them sink in. She had spent so much time trying to fit into a mold that others had created. For her, caring about the optics, the public opinion, making sure every move was strategic. What if, instead of responding with more calculated political rhetoric, she leaned into her own authenticity? What if, in this moment, she stopped being someone else's idea of a conservative and became her own version? The revelation hit her like a jolt of electricity. She didn't need to be anyone else. She didn't need to play the part of the perfect, unflappable politician. It was time to stop pretending. Just then, Rachel called, her voice a steady anchor amidst Karoline's storm of thoughts. "I think you should go on air. Go live. Do it now while the world's still watching." Karoline's pulse quickened. The idea was bold, reckless even, but it resonated. This wasn't about having a perfect response anymore. It was about showing the world who she truly was. Not a polished, composed image, but the real Karoline. The woman who had faced countless challenges and kept standing. "I'm doing it," Karoline said, her voice firmer than it had been in days. As she hung up the phone, the weight of the moment felt lighter. She wasn't just responding to an insult. She was reclaiming her narrative. There was no going back now. The stakes had never been higher, but this time, she was in control. Karoline paced back and forth in her apartment, the seconds stretching into an agonizing eternity as she prepared for her moment. She could feel the weight of the world pressing in on her. This wasn't just another interview, another political discussion. It was the defining moment of her career, the moment where she would either rise or crumble under the pressure. She couldn't afford to get this wrong. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Stephen. "You sure about this? It's risky. The media will rip you apart if you're not careful." She looked at the screen for a moment, almost tempted to reply. But no, this was the moment that could change everything. If she played it safe, she'd remain in the shadow of others' opinions, forever tied to the version of herself they expected her to be. No, today she was going to speak from the heart. The plan was simple. Go live on social media, face the world, head on, and finally speak the truth about what had been eating away at her. She wasn't just going to apologize for getting upset in the debate. She wasn't going to apologize for anything. She was going to make them listen. "Get ready, Karoline," Rachel said, her voice steady but filled with anticipation. "You've got this." Karoline took a deep breath and hit record. The camera flickered to life, capturing her in the stark, empty space of her living room. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she leaned forward, her eyes focused with a fierce intensity. "You all saw what happened yesterday," she began, her voice steady but raw. "The attack was personal, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt. But here's the thing. I'm not ashamed of who I am, and I'm not ashamed of my beliefs. Not for 1 second. The words came out faster now, the fire inside her, burning brighter. The anger was no longer a source of shame. It was a source of power. What happened wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on all of us. On anyone who dares to speak out. On anyone who stands up for what they believe in. I'm not here to play their game anymore. I'm here to stand up for the truth, my truth. And if that makes me the target, so be it. Karoline's hand trembled, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the weight of knowing that she was at last being real. You want to know why I'm doing this? She continued, her voice louder now. Because I refuse to let anyone define my worth. And I'm not here to cater to your expectations. If you want to criticize me for being a conservative, for speaking out on the issues that matter to me, fine. But know this, I'm not going anywhere. And I'm not going to apologize for speaking my mind. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle in the silence that followed. The tension in the room was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Karoline's pulse was racing, but in this moment, she had never felt more alive. As she stared into the lens, her phone began to buzz with notifications, but she didn't flinch. Her followers, her real supporters, were flooding in. Some comments came in fast, others slowly. But the message was the same. They were with her. They believed in her. I am who I am, she said finally, her voice unwavering. And I'm going to keep fighting. This is just the beginning. She pressed stop. The camera turned off, but the feeling remained, electric, raw, and full of purpose. In that instant, Karoline knew she had done it. She had taken control of the narrative. It wasn't about whether the world accepted her now. It was about whether she could accept herself. And she had, in that moment, with more conviction than ever before. What came next was beyond her control. But no matter what, Karoline Leavitt had reclaimed her voice, and there was no turning back. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Karoline's video went viral almost instantly. News outlets picked up the story, discussing the bold move she had made by confronting the media head-on, refusing to be silenced. Social media exploded with a mixture of praise and criticism, but for the first time in a long while, Karoline didn't care about the negative comments. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone but herself. The narrative was hers to control, now. In the days that followed, the media frenzy slowed down, but the buzz remained. Karoline had received messages of support from unlikely places, colleagues from both sides of the aisle, former adversaries, and everyday people who had been watching quietly in the background. It wasn't just the political elites who had taken note. It was the general public, the very people Karoline had been fighting for all along. They'd seen her humanity, her vulnerability, and her strength. She hadn't just won an argument. She had won their respect. Even her mentor, James, reached out. His words were brief but meaningful. You did it your way. That's all anyone can ask for. But it wasn't just the public's reaction that had shifted. Karoline had changed too. The self-doubt that had plagued her for so long was gone. In its place was a quiet confidence, a sense of peace with who she was and what she represented. She wasn't playing a game anymore. She was living her truth. Rachel, as always, had been by her side, helping her navigate the media storm and offering a sense of calm when Karoline had begun to doubt herself. You've come a long way, Rachel said over coffee one morning, watching, as Karoline answered the final few questions from a news outlet. I knew you had it in you. Karoline smiled, grateful for the unwavering support from her friend. She thought back to that first moment in the studio, when the insult had taken her off guard. At the time, she'd been ready to crumble, to give in to the pressure of everyone else's expectations. But now, standing tall, she understood. It was never about what others thought of her. It was about her belief in herself, her strength to fight for what mattered. The conversation eventually turned to the future, where Karoline could go from here, what next steps would look like. But in that moment, sitting with Rachel, it didn't seem as important. What mattered now was that she had found her voice, her true self, and that nothing, no insult, no public scrutiny, could ever take that away. As the day wore on, Karoline reflected on the lessons she had learned. She had faced the crucible of public judgment and emerged stronger, more resolute. She wasn't perfect, but she was real, and that was enough. Sitting by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Karoline whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The world had tried to silence her, but now it would have to listen.